When we address the issue of poverty, I think we really have to look at who benefits from poverty. And the fact of the matter is the wealthy folks benefit from poverty. So in a way you might say that the problem is not so much poverty as the problem is wealth, prosperity, and when it's taken to an extreme, that wealth is used as the measure of value in a culture, which is what's happened in our culture. And in fact, it began happening 3,000 years ago. And we've been moving in that direction ever since, so that we judge ourselves, we judge our societies, we judge individuals by how much wealth they have. In order for a relatively small percentage of the population to have a lot of wealth, you've got to have a very large percentage of the population essentially acting as slaves. They've got to be impoverished. So as long as we live in a system that honors that, in a system that requires slavery, in essence slavery, to move it forward, we're going to have poverty, because it's absolutely to the advantage of the corporatocracy, of the people who control our biggest businesses and corporations, to have a mass of poor people around the world that they can draw on for labor, that they can draw on to steal their resources, whether it's oil or diamonds or coltan or whatever the resources are. And as long as those people remain impoverished, as we call it, then they're at the mercy of those of us with wealth, and we get to exploit them. It's a sad fact of life that back in the 70s, when I was an economic hitman, you know, we had a gap between rich and poor, but today it's twice as wide as it was then. And today, more than half the world's population lives on less than $2 a day, which, despite what a lot of people seem to think, isn't enough in almost any of these countries to live a decent life. It's a slave wage, really, when you come right down to it in most of these places. It's gotten worse. We've portrayed this period of time since 1970 to now as being a time of development, and being a time when the developed world has invested huge amounts of money in the developing world in order to help bring it up. But the fact of the matter is none of that's happened. The fact of the matter is we in the developed world have gotten richer and richer and richer and more prosperous and more powerful. They in the developing world have become poorer and poorer and poorer. Now, the deception here is that if you go into one of the major cities in almost any of these developing countries, you'll see incredible skyscrapers, beautiful buildings. It looks prosperous. What you don't see is that beneath all of that there's a lot more poor people, and they're a lot poorer than they were before. So this whole idea of investing money in these countries and into the infrastructure and developing them hasn't worked from the standpoint of alleviating poverty or even reducing it. It's increased it. It has worked from the standpoint of making us richer, making the corporatocracy more powerful and richer. It's been a huge success from that standpoint. I think a basic question that we have to ask ourselves is who foments this system? And perhaps we have to then look at, if we are an empire, where's the emperor? Because there is no emperor of the world today, and the United States doesn't have an emperor, it seems. But in fact, we do. We have the equivalent, and that is what I call the corporatocracy, which are very few, primarily men, who run our biggest corporations, and through them they control the United States government and every other one in the world too that they want to control. And it doesn't matter whether in the United States we have a Republican or a Democrat in the White House or in Congress. There are details that make a difference, but from the standpoint of expanding the empire, it happens under both regimes because it's controlled by the corporatocracy. And in fact, at the highest levels, the people in the government and the people at the top of the big corporations are one and the same. They go through what we call the revolving door. So one year somebody's president of a huge corporation, and the next year he or she is Secretary of State or Vice President or even President. And so this system is controlled by what I call the corporatocracy. We can say without a doubt that this system is an absolute failure. From the most rational, objective economic standpoint, it's a failure. Less than 5% of the world's population live in the United States. We are consuming over 25% of the world's resources and creating roughly 30% of its major pollution. that's a failure. That's not a model you can take to China or India or Africa or Latin America. Simple mathematics tells you you can't repeat this model. 5% of the world consuming 25% of the resources. You can't, in China and India together, that takes us totally off the chart. It's a failed system. From a historical perspective, it's an interesting evolution. So for several thousand years, we had the idea of empires, kind of an accepted idea, and it's a romanticized idea. You know, the great empires of history that were not only building empires but spreading civilization, and that was the concept. And certainly, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the English, the Germans, the Dutch, as they spread their empires back in the time of the great discoveries and explorations that we call it, it was very obvious that they were spreading empires. There was no secret here. If you send your young men and sometimes women off to conquer other lands, everybody knows you're doing it, and it was accepted. It was accepted partly because these were small countries with very few resources internally, and the way for them to become rich was to go out and exploit others, labor and resources. And the other thing that was justified was it was done in the name of religion. It was done in the name of culture, of civilization. We want to civilize the heathens. And so there was all this theory built up around it, but it was out in the open. Everybody knew that it was happening. And then during the time between the two world wars and the time of Hitler, and during this period, the idea of imperialism and the idea of colonialism began to take on a dark quality. And when we emerged from World War II, we created the World Bank, and eventually the IMF and the United Nations, and the idea was that we're going to create a different kind of a world. But as we came out of that period, we in the Western countries, led by the United States, I think, saw the new enemy as being communism, the Soviet Union. And so we created these institutions like the World Bank and to reconstruct a devastated Europe. Very good principles behind the mission statement of these organizations, that would still hold today. But very quickly, they began to channel their resources into convincing the world, and particularly developing countries, not to go with the Soviet Union, to convincing the world that our system of imperialistic capitalism was better than the Soviet system. So in order to do this, these institutions became very friendly with, they developed very cozy relationships with the corporatocracy, with the big corporations. And this became stronger and stronger during the 50s and the 60s, and the corporations became stronger and stronger. At the same time, we launched the corporations launched huge campaigns to convince the public that what's good for business is good for America and the world, and that really the American dream was to create a few very rich people, that was part of the American dream. And greed began to be taught in business schools, and it pervades boardrooms today. That's the objective, make a few people very, very rich. And so the system began to evolve, but at the same time we had this aversion to colonialism, to empire, to imperialism. We said we had an aversion. We didn't like what Hitler had done. We began to look back and say, well, what those conquistadores did, and the British and the French and everybody else, that wasn't good. But in fact, we were still living in that system. So it started in Iran when Mossadegh was elected democratically as president of Iran in the early 50s, and he began to nationalize oil companies, and we didn't like that. So we decided we had to get rid of him, and we sent in a CIA agent, Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, and he was extremely successful at getting rid of this democratically elected president of Iran and replacing him with a terrible dictator, the Shah. But he did it very quietly. He did it with a few $1 million and without much violence and without the risk of war with the Soviet Union. And at that point we feared nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And so this sent a really strong message. This works. This is the new way to build empire. Use economic hitmen. Kermit Roosevelt was in essence the first economic hitman. He was also a jackal. He was the two combined. But he was a CIA agent, a card-carrying government employee, and so very quickly we realized that that's no good. But if he'd been caught, we would have looked pretty bad. So we developed a new class of people, which were like me. We work for private companies, consulting firms, whatever, and we're economic hitmen. In essence, we work for the corporatocracy, the government, but we're not paid directly by them. We're paid by a consulting firm. So how does the system really work? You know, we economic hitmen have many vehicles to make this happen, but perhaps the most common one is that we will identify a country, usually a developing country, that has resources we covet, our corporations covet, like oil. And then we arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. Now, most everybody in our country believes that that loan is going to help poor people. It isn't. Most of the money never goes to the country. In fact, it goes to our own corporations. It goes to the Bechtels and the Halliburtons and the ones we all hear about, usually led by engineering firms, but a lot of other companies are brought in. And they make fortunes off building big infrastructure projects in that country. Power plants, industrial parks, ports, those types of things. Things that don't benefit the poor people at all. They're not connected to the electrical grid. They don't get the jobs in the industrial parks because they're not educated enough. But they, as a class, are left holding a huge debt. The country goes deep into debt in order to make this happen. And a few of its wealthy people get very rich in the process. They own the big industries that do benefit from the ports and the highways and the industrial parks and the electricity. The country's left holding this huge debt that it can't possibly repay. So at some point, we economic hitmen go back in and we say, you know, you can't pay your debts. You owe us a pound of flesh. You owe us a big favor. So sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies, or vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq. And so we use this whole process as, first of all, getting their money, basically, money we loan them, to enrich our own corporations, and then to use the debt to enslave them, to imprison them, to get them to have to agree to selling off their resources cheap. It's an amazing system, and in the process of doing that, we have, in essence, created this empire. And we've done it without the military, without most citizens knowing that it ever happened. In fact, most citizens believing we've done a great thing. We've spent billions of dollars on building an electrical system, industrial parks, and so on and so forth. We've given this country a huge gift. And the truth of the matter is exactly the opposite of that. We've given this country, we've put this country in a terrible, terrible situation, a terrible predicament. A few of its wealthy people have made a lot of money, and they've invested in real estate in Florida or Swiss banks or stock markets overseas. They've taken their money out of the country, and they've become very rich. And if something goes wrong in the country, they just leave. But the other people are left holding this huge debt, and as a result, they can't afford the education systems, the water and sewage systems that they need, the health care, and all the other civil amenities that they need. And of course, that in turn feeds the whole system, so we can go back in later and offer another loan to privatize their education system or to develop their sanitation system, and the process is repeated and repeated and repeated, and it just keeps going on. It's very effective. It's a very effective way of building an empire. It's very unfortunate that most people, certainly in America and I think many other places, feel that foreign aid is foreign aid, that it's altruistic, that it helps these countries, and it almost never does. There are some exceptions. After a tsunami or a great natural disaster, immediately some foreign aid goes in to put up tents and bring in food and water and so forth. But very soon after that, that gets corrupted too, and you start using that to build big hotels that are owned by the big international chains and restaurants and so on, not helping the mom and pop organizations. But we don't hear that. We think foreign aid is altruistic, that it's there to help people. In fact, it's only there to help the corporatocracy. Yeah, that's what it's for. That's how the system is set up. I think that's terribly unfortunate. I'd like to see foreign aid really work that way. You know, we could do some really good things with that. Or even better, just leave people alone. I find it fascinating that as I travel around Latin America, I speak Spanish, I've spent a lot of time there, what I'm hearing from the leaders there is not that they're looking for us for any kind of help at all. This whole new genre of leaders that is emerging is simply saying, let us use our own resources to pull our people up by their bootstraps. We can do it. Just don't steal our resources anymore. When someone like me is sent into a country to justify a loan, for example, one to develop a power system, we develop these 20, 25-year economic forecasts that show that if we invest this money into the electric system, then the economy is going to take off. That's all that's needed. And we inflate these tremendously, hugely inflated forecasts. And these are not realistic by any means, and the people making the forecasts know they're not realistic. Tremendous pressure is put upon us. Tremendous pressure was put upon me to make these forecasts higher and higher and higher to justify more and more loans. So the economic forecasts are developed to justify loans, not to present any picture of reality. Modern econometrics and mathematical modeling of economies makes it quite easy to do this. You can change the statistics in such a way or massage them in such a way that they'll show you basically anything you want them to. I can share a personal experience about how we tweak economic forecasts, how we skew them. Certainly, I knew that's what I was supposed to do. My bosses at my company put a tremendous amount of pressure on me to do these things, and this pressure it's quite easy. I talk in one of my books about how the person who, my predecessor, was retiring, and he was determined to be integritous and not tweak the forecasts, so he was fired, and I was given his job with the clear understanding. I knew why he was fired, and I knew that if I wanted to progress in this company, I would tweak the forecasts. And when I later hired other people, and I ended up having several dozen very highly skilled economists and financial experts working for me, they all knew that their bonuses, their raises, everything depended on going along with this system. Now, when we take these forecasts to the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank or any of these other organizations, there are people in that organization that are supposed to catch this. If we're being non-integritous, if we're tweaking forecasts, there are specialists there that are supposed to review this. And my experience was that some of these guys really are integritous. They wanted to punch holes in my forecast. And I would often have to stand before a board or a committee at the banks and defend my forecast, and they would pick holes in them. Some of these people who were quite junior really saw through what I was doing. But I always knew that above those people, their bosses knew exactly what was going on, and they were determined that the country that I was doing this forecast for was going to get that loan, that this was going to move forward. So it was a charade. But sometimes we would spend several months before these committees justifying, arguing, debating, and going back and tweaking some more and writing more reports. And it was almost like appearing before a court of law. You know, it was like two lawyers opposing each other, and we'd have our teams and we would set them up. So within the bank itself, there were experts, there were econometricians, economists who were quite integritous, and they saw through what we were doing, but they never won, ultimately, because their bosses were on my side. Although it was never that obvious, but we always won, ultimately. This isn't a mistake when these things that happen of building debt in these countries that can't repay it is not a mistake. It's a policy. It's well known. Everybody knows it's going on. And I do want to make it very clear that within organizations like the World Bank and many of these corporations, there's some very, very good people and conscientious people and hard-working people, and it can be easy for them to convince themselves that they're doing a good thing. I found it easy to convince myself, and what I did was not illegal as an economic hitman. It should be illegal, but it isn't. You know, if I were to lend somebody, if I'm a banker and I lend somebody a lot of money knowing they can't repay it because I want to get a favor from them later, that's illegal. But when I do it on a national level or through the World Bank, it's not illegal. And I knew, as a lot of these other people do, deep in my heart, that what I was doing was wrong, but it's so easy to justify because it's taught in our business schools, it's taught in our law schools that this is the way to make development happen. Investing in infrastructure is the way to make development happen. And the statistics can show that it works. They can show that gross national product, that the overall economy improves. But the fact is that in most of these countries, only a very few people benefit from the overall economy. Everybody else is outside that economy. They're living subsistence lives, or they're living lives that basically aren't part of that economy. And so it's easy for people at the World Bank or others to look at what they're doing and say, this is a good thing. It's easy for people at Nike, for example, to say these sweatshops in Indonesia are making people's lives better, even though if they really go over there and look at the people, they know their lives are getting worse. But they can say, well, we're going to improve. There's always that thing that's held out, that we can do it better, that we're doing something good. But deep in our hearts, anybody who's really looking at this, anybody that really watches what's going on, deep in that person's heart, as in mine, we know it's wrong. And yet, the other aspect is that we're living a good life. I get paid a good salary. These people at the bank, at the World Bank, at Nike, everywhere else, they're getting good salaries. They're able to give their kids good educations. Their families are happy with the materialism and so forth. So you get these two factors working. They're prospering, and philosophically, they can justify it. I was invited to speak at Harvard and other schools about what I was doing, and I was patted on the back for this. So it's easy to justify it. But when you really look beneath the surface, you know that what you're doing is wrong. And I think therein lies part of the solution, because human beings really want to take care of the future and future generations, I think, deep in their hearts. And so if we force people to really see that what we're doing is wrong and ultimately destructive for our progeny, then we will be able to get people to change. And recently, there's been a lot of talk about debt forgiveness. 18 countries were singled out as ones that were in line to have their debt forgiven. I wish that would happen. I'm totally for debt forgiveness, but it has to be unconditional. And unfortunately, none of this is unconditional. So what it turns out is this round of debt forgiveness that's been proposed is an incredible subterfuge. It's one of the best economic hitman tricks I've heard to date. So that each one of these 18 countries then will have to agree to conditionalities that benefit the corporatocracy. Things like privatizing. That's a big one, that they have to privatize. And another one is that they will not be able to ship out products or raw materials that threaten ours, such as some agricultural goods, that they will have to accept restrictions on what they can sell to the United States and the G8 countries. And on the other hand, they will have to accept our restrictions. And so it's this very, very rigged system. And the world hears, oh, debt forgiveness. And celebrities go out and talk about debt forgiveness, and they're being exploited too. And we all say, oh, isn't it wonderful? We're being so generous. We're going to forgive all this debt. We've given all these countries all this money. Now we're going to tell them they don't have to pay it back. The fact of the matter is we've asked for something much worse. They would be so much better off never to have had the debt, of course, or to just pay it off. As an example, let's take a country that has accumulated a lot of debt, and they owe the World Bank or one of these organizations money, and they come back and say, well, you know, we need a new water system in one of our cities. For example, Bolivia did this with Cochabamba. We need a new water system. And the IMF at this point steps in and says, well, you've got a lot of debt, and somehow we've got to restructure things. We've got to implement some policies that'll rationalize this process. And so, yes, Cochabamba needs a new water system or better management. So what you need to do is privatize it, because obviously the current system isn't working. And so the deal is struck that there may be some money invested into that system if privatization occurs. And the privatization is rigged. You know, it's going to be one of our companies that's going to own it. In the case of Cochabamba, it was Bechtel, or a subsidiary of Bechtel. And they went in and developed the water system and restructured the whole thing in Cochabamba. And suddenly water became extremely expensive for the poor people. They couldn't afford it. And they rebelled against it. And they were very, very upset and rebelled against it. And eventually, Bechtel was forced to leave. But it didn't stop there, because Bechtel now says, well, you know, we've got lost profits. We expected to go in there and make certain profits. Now, legally, the United States and Bolivia do not have an agreement that allows a U.S. corporation to sue. So Bechtel used a subsidiary in one of its European countries, one of its own subsidiaries, that does have such an agreement, and went in and sued Bolivia for lost profits that they hoped to realize and weren't able to because they had to leave under protest. And this suit went on for a while. After Morales was elected president of Bolivia, Bechtel dropped the suit and basically went away. But I think that example tells an awful lot, because we set this thing up so that we put a country deep into debt. They come and look for something more. They need water, they need sewage, they need all kinds of things like this really for the poor people. And the IMF then steps in and sets the guidelines. and it sets what it calls conditionalities. And one of the conditionalities in this case, and in many, is to privatize, to turn the thing over to one of our companies. And that just perpetuates the system. And in the case of Bolivia, the Bolivians rebelled. And they elected a president who then was a real threat to the corporatocracy, and so Bechtel dropped the suit. If somebody else had been elected president of Bolivia, Bechtel, I'm sure, would have stayed in there with their lawsuit and probably would have eventually won it and gotten paid damages by Bolivia, but it didn't happen that way. And that goes on and on and on in country after country after country. If we don't like what a democratically elected leader of another country is doing, for example, opposing the exploitation of oil in his country, as Chavez is doing in Venezuela, or the exploitation of gas or water, as Morales is doing in Bolivia, then we try to corrupt people into changing that and going back to the old system. And we try to corrupt those particular officials. So in the case of South America, in recent elections, 7 countries representing over 80% of South American population elected presidents that ran on an anti-corporatocracy platform. Now, these presidents did not run on an anti-American or anti-European policy. If I, as an American, go to any one of these countries, I'll be embraced with open arms. And they love our principles. They love our Declaration of Independence, but they hate having their resources exploited by us. That's what they ran against, the corporatocracy. And once these presidents were elected, someone who looks like me, I had the job at one time, will walk into that president's office, speaks the language, speaks Spanish, whatever, Portuguese, walks into the office and says, "Congratulations, Mr. President," or in the case of Chile, Ms. President. And now I just want to remind you that I can make you and your family very, very rich if you play my game, our game. Or I can see to it that you're thrown out of office or assassinated if you decide to fulfill your campaign promises. And usually it's said a little more subtly than that because there may be a tape recorder listening. But they get the message because every one of those presidents knows what happened to Arbenz of Guatemala, and Allende of Chile, and Roldos of Ecuador, and Lumumba of the Congo, and Torrijos, and on. The list is very long of presidents that we have had thrown out or assassinated. There's no question about that. And they all know this. So we perpetuate the system that way. Here you offer from this pocket you offer a few $100 million, corruption. Or from this pocket you offer subversives, jackals, to go in and overthrow the government or assassinate the president. And if I'm in that position, if I'm the president, and even if I'm very integritous and I really believe in what I'm going to do, what I've said, well, what am I going to do? Because I know that they can do this. So I'm very tempted to accept the corruption, because if I don't, I'm going to be taken out. And if I'm taken out, what's the next guy going to do? He's going to be scared to death. And so, yes, there are a lot of very corrupt officials, but who's doing the corrupting? We're doing the corrupting in most cases. And I talked about this on a presidential level, but it happens all the way down through the ranks. It happens at every governmental level, and it happens in the corporations in those countries, and it happens throughout the whole system. So if the corporatocracy does not like what's going on in Nigeria or Botswana or Thailand or any other country, they go in and they send people like me, and they send economic hitmen in, and we try to corrupt the system. We offer the bribe and at the same time the threat. And if the leader doesn't buy, then in fact we do send in what we call the jackals, and they overthrow the government or they assassinate the leader. And this has happened time and time and time again. In Iran, under Mossadegh, you know, we overthrew a leader, a democratically elected leader, because he wanted to get more of the oil profits from Iranian oil to go to the Iranian people. We did the same thing in Iraq under Qasem, who was a very popular president of Iraq, and decided that he wanted to get more of the profits from Iraqi oil to go to the Iraqi people, not to the foreign companies. So we decided he had to go, he had to be assassinated. We sent an assassination team in the early 60s. It was headed by a young man at the time who failed, and got wounded in the process and had to flee the country. That was Saddam Hussein. He was our hired assassin. He failed, so the CIA went in directly and had Qasem publicly executed on Iraqi television and put Saddam's family in power. We've done this time after time after time. Usually the economic hitmen are successful, so we don't need to send in the jackals. But on those occasions when we're not successful, as for me, I failed with Omar Torrijos in Panama and Jaime Roldos in Ecuador, and so the jackals were sent in and assassinated these men. On the very few instances when neither the economic hitmen nor the jackals are successful, then and only then do we send in the military. And this is what happened in Iraq. You know, the economic hitmen were unable to bring Saddam Hussein around. The jackals were unable to take him out. He had very loyal guards and he had look-alike doubles, so it was difficult to take him out. And so we sent in the military. And the first time we sent in the military, we could have certainly taken Saddam out at that point, but we didn't want to. He was the type of strong man that the corporatocracy loves. He could keep the Iranians in their borders and keep the Kurds under control and keep pumping oil to us. And we figured that in '91, when we took his military out, that we had sufficiently chastised him that now he would come around. And he didn't. When the economic hitmen went back in the '90s, he still refused, and the jackals were unable to take him out then again. So this time we sent in the military, and we did take him out. And the rest is history. This whole question of immigration is a fascinating one. I speak Spanish, and I often go out and talk with Guatemalans or Colombians or Mexicans or people who are here mowing our lawns and picking our fruits and vegetables. These immigrants, many of them illegal. We're trying to build a fence now to stop them. I have never spoken to one of them who wants to be in this country. They all want to be back in their countries, and these are beautiful countries. Mexico's a beautiful country. Bolivia's a beautiful country. Guatemala. They want to be back there with their families. They can't afford to be. There are no jobs for them there, and that's to a large degree because of the system that we've created, what we call the fair trade systems, the NAFTAs, and all these systems that we've created that are exploiting these countries terribly. They don't have the jobs there, so they come here so they can make money, and they send a great deal of that money back to their families back there. They're not enjoying themselves in this country. They're working very, very hard, and they're performing tasks that most of us don't want to perform. And this is terribly sad. So once again, the solution to the immigration problem, and it can be a problem, yes, it can hurt our workers here. I totally sympathize with people here that feel threatened by this. But the solution is not building a fence. It's not trying to keep the people physically out. It's to allow them to create the conditions in their country that will allow them to live there. These countries have great resources. That's why we're exploiting them. We need to create a world where they can work with their own resources in their own countries. That's where they want to be, and they've got the resources. But the opposite has happened. We've created a situation where they can't find work in those countries, where we've mechanized things, where we've done it our way, a very different way, where we're exploiting them. We need to reverse that and to recognize that a fence isn't going to solve the problem, and immigration laws aren't going to solve the problem. The problem is solved not with Band-Aids like those, but by going to the root cause. This planet is hemorrhaging badly, environmentally and socially. People are hemorrhaging badly, and we may need a few Band-Aids in the interim to kind of stop the bleeding, but ultimately we've got to go to the root cause of the wound. Where is this disease coming from? Where is this injury coming from? What's the problem? And in almost every case today, the problem is the system we've created. It is the empire. It's what the corporatocracy has created. It's what I, as an economic hitman, created and am having to live with now. We need to go to that root cause, and we need to dig it out, get rid of it, change it, and implement a better system. I've met a lot of insurgents, revolutionaries. In writing books, I've sought them out. When I was an economic hitman, I had contact with them. I have never met one that wanted to be an insurgent. They want to be farmers. They want to be merchants. They want to be with their families. They don't want to carry guns. Now, I'm sure there's some crazy people out there. There's always a few that probably would do that. But the majority of these people are desperate, desperate people. Their families are starving. They don't see any hope for the future. They see themselves being terribly exploited and their kids being exploited. They're a lot like my own ancestors in the 1700s in this country who out of desperation stood up to the largest empire in the world. These people are seeing things the same way. They don't want to be doing that. They don't want to put their lives on the line. Whether it's in the Middle East or in South America or in Africa, most of these people are just plain desperate. The way for us to protect ourselves is not to think that we can kill them all, or not to think that we can control them by military means. The way to defend ourselves is to take away the conditions that cause the desperation, the hatred and the anger. That's our best protection. Our money is not well spent when it goes into the military to go to other countries to think that we can put down people who are only trying to defend their lands and make a better life for them and their families. The way that we can defend ourselves is to give them the opportunity to really do that, to make a better life, and to make that commitment ourselves that we're going to work with them. We're going to be partners with these people to help them make a better life, because we know that will make our lives better and our children's lives. And that's the only way we can do it. I think the solution is for all of us to understand that the only way we're going to have a sane and stable and sustainable world is through really, really helping these countries to do what they need to do themselves, giving the people in these countries the power to determine their own future, not allowing dictators to do it, not allowing our corporations to do it, to really give them the opportunity to do this, and to recognize that we truly are all one on this planet. We're very connected. We're a very, very small community. To pull the corporations off them, to stop exploiting them, and in fact to turn it around so that corporations and all of our institutions truly embrace them. If Nike's going to have factories in Indonesia, the Indonesian people, the workers in those factories, need to have a say. and they need to have a share, and their best interests need to be the first thing that Nike or any other corporation looks to. What it serves the best interests of the people working in these companies, not what serves the best interests of the owners of the corporation. And only by doing that, and only by all of us taking a stance that we're not going to buy the products from any company that doesn't do that, are we going to pull ourselves out of this. I think that one of the exciting things right now is that a country like the United States that really is the leader of the modern empire. We are the modern empire, and we've got a lot of allies throughout Europe and Japan and many other places. But we are sort of like the coach of the team and the captain of the team. But at the core of our country, and at the core of many of the other countries also, are some very incredible principles of equality and sustainability and stability. You know, in the American Declaration of Independence, we talk about government for the people, of the people, by the people, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's a value system that's very different from the one that created the division between wealth and poverty. And so this has been defined for us. And in a way, we've all bought into it. The world loves these ideas. And the revolutions that are going on in South America today really reflect that. These countries are saying, this is what we want. Government for, of, and by the people. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody. And so I think we've reached a time now where we know a couple of things. We know, A, that we've created a global empire. And that's not a good thing, but in the process of doing that, we've created systems of communication so that we can reach everybody on the planet. And B, we've created resources that make it possible to be in a situation where nobody needs to starve. 24,000 people die every single day from hunger and hunger-related diseases, at least 24,000. And that doesn't need to happen. We have plenty of resources, so that shouldn't happen. It happens because of the system we've created. But we know we're now at a time when we have resources that can stop that. And we have the networks around the world to make it happen so that this doesn't have to happen, that this doesn't have to occur. And the third thing that's happened is we realize that we live on a very small planet. We are one community. And certainly, if we didn't already know it, 9/11 taught us that. The conquistadores never had to worry about the Incas attacking Madrid. And the French and British never had to worry about their Asian or African colonies attacking Paris or London. We know today that we're very, very vulnerable to people in Afghanistan or wherever they happen to be. Our cities are vulnerable. We live on a very small planet. I know that my daughter, who's 24, and her children are not going to have a stable, sustainable, and sane world unless every child born in Ethiopia and Indonesia and Bolivia also has that expectation. This is a very small community. So we've got these three elements at play right now. We've created a global empire, and we have all the resources, including communications networks, that we need to alleviate suffering, to narrow the gap between rich and poor. And we know that we live on a very small planet, in a very small community, and that we must create a new world. We must, for the survival of our future generations. To me, that gives us great hope that we finally have arrived at a time where we can realize the ideals expressed by the Declaration of Independence in the United States and by many other sacred documents that were actually started in France and England and other parts of Europe and Asia, that all came together to form the philosophy behind this new approach to living that evolved in the 1700s. And we're now reaching a time where I think we can see that this has to be brought in on a global level. So I find this to be very, very exciting that we can break this pattern that may be, it's at least 3,000 years old, it may be older, and now is the time to break that pattern. I also find as I travel around the world that there's a tremendous outcry to do this, people really want to do. We've seen it very strongly in South America, and we're increasingly seeing it in Europe and the United States, and certainly the Middle East. A lot of what's going on in the Middle East is an expression of this, although that doesn't usually make the mainstream media. But so much of what's going on in the Middle East is an expression of this demand that we reduce this gap, that we change the paradigm, that we do get rid of poverty. And in fact, we get rid of the idea of wealth that creates the idea of poverty. So I look forward to this period as a young person growing up in New Hampshire. I come from 300 years of Yankees in New Hampshire and who fought in the American Revolution. My family was very involved in these things. And I used to think, when I was a kid, I used to wish that I had been born in the 1700s so I could have been part of the American Revolution. What I know now is I think that this is even a more exciting and important time in history, because we have the opportunity to implement these ideas on a truly global level.